Hello and welcome to Student Affairs Live, the weekly web show for student affairs professionals in higher education. This episode of Student Affairs Live is part of the Higher Ed Live Network, offering viewers direct access to the best and brightest minds in education. Live webcasts allow viewers to share knowledge and participate in discussions around the most important issues in student affairs. You can tune in to Student Affairs Live on Wednesdays. I am your host, Heather Shea Gasser from Michigan State University, and I'm excited to welcome several friends and colleagues to the show today to talk about professional heartbreak and the journey towards healing. I suspect this topic will resonate with many of you. If you have a question or would like to comment on today's show, please tweet us using the Higher Ed Live hashtag. Thank you to Valerie Hreska, who will be monitoring our back channel today. Once again, thank you so much, Val. Before we get on to the show, I would like to give a quick shout out to our show's sponsors. Higher Ed Live is produced by M. Stoner, a marketing and communications firm that works with education institutions on branding, strategy, web design, and more. If your website needs help, you probably know it, but redesign projects are difficult. 3 basics, preliminary steps can make the difference between a successful process and an administrative mess. Learn more and download M. Stoner's newest white paper on redesigning your website. We have a tweet that we're sending out right now regarding that white paper. Student Affairs Live is also excited to welcome a new host to the Higher Ed Live family. Just today, we announced Rob Zinkin, who works at the University of Indiana, is going to be joining Higher Ed Live on the Marketing Live channel with Amy Jorgensen, and his bio is also being tweeted out now. So welcome, Rob. Student Affairs Live is also exclusively sponsored by ACPA, College Student Educators International. ACPA's strategic partnership with Higher Ed Live calls attention to the pairing of innovative professional development delivery with the strength of a renowned professional association. ACPA publishes the Journal of College Student Development and About Campus. So on with today's show. Opportunities to reflect come in many forms. Sometimes during the course of our jobs, we face challenging and difficult situations that adversely affect our ability to assist others and work with students. On this episode of Higher Ed Live, we're going to talk with 4 folks who have been there and believe that these difficult processes have value. We're going to share some strategies to survive and thrive during and after professional heartbreak. So I'd like to welcome my guests, Tim, Laura, Steve, and Regina, to Student Affairs Live. If you all would like to read more about each of the 4 of them, please visit the Higher Ed Live website link that we are tweeting out now for their complete bios. So welcome to all 4 of you. Let's start with a quick intro. Can each of you share your home institution, current position, and as well as one recent celebratory event in your life? So we're gonna start on the positive today. Steve, why don't you start?
Hi everyone, thanks for joining us. I'm Steve Sutton. I work as the Assistant Vice Chancellor here at UC Berkeley in Student Affairs. Our celebratory event for my partner and I is that we sent a freshman to college back in the fall. And so that's been a wonderful experience for me as a student affairs professional to learn more about how to do better at my job and also be better as a parent as well.
That's a great one. Laura.
Hello, everyone. I'm Laura Bayless, and I'm the Assistant Vice Chancellor for Student Affairs at UW-Platteville, and that means I'm the Chief Student Affairs Officer here. And for me, in the next few weeks, not only do I get to celebrate graduations on our own campus here at UW-Platteville, but my nephew is graduating from college, and my stepson is graduating from high school, and they are both ready to move on to their next thing. My nephew is gainfully employed at a job in Boston as soon as he finishes. And my stepson is going to be going to the University of Michigan, so it's very exciting.
Very cool, very cool. All right, Tim.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Tim Gordon. I'm the Dean of Students at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, and our celebratory event is that my daughter will be competing in a citywide ballroom dancing competition in just a couple weeks.
Ooh, that's good. That's great. Regina.
Hello, everyone. My name is Regina Smake. I'm at the University of Michigan, and I serve as the Director of Academic Services and Financial Aid at the Stephen M. Ross School of Business. My event is that I am celebrating some positive feedback that I've received from my children about my parenting, and specifically my daughter, who is about to go on a study abroad trip, recently texted me from that pre-trip session to tell me that she appreciated me and appreciated the fact that I was not a helicopter parent, because apparently the number of her colleagues had brought their parents to this session. So.
Yay! Everybody watching, as we talked about earlier, is going, all right, good job. Okay, so now I personally have my own professional heartbreak stories, actually probably multiple stories, but I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about those today. But each of you, and I know this takes some vulnerability, would love to spend just a little bit of time setting some context and some base level understanding with all of our viewers today. So can each of you talk briefly about your professional heartbreak story? And we're going to start with Tim.
Thanks, Heather. So my professional heartbreak story really that I like to share as a part of this session is about having a mentor who was a mentor in my freshman year, then became a potential employer after I left graduate school, and interviewed for a position, did really well with that mentor who was chairing the search committee, had gotten all the signals that I would get the position, was very excited about it, and then got feedback from a colleague who was on the search committee who really was struggling with some ethical pieces in terms of her knowing that the chair of the committee was choosing not to hire me because of quote unquote my lifestyle choices, which was alluding to the fact that I'm openly gay, and so I didn't get that position, and knew that information and really couldn't act on that information, but also of course had the heartbreak of having someone who I thought was my mentor and someone that I had confided in really sort of betray that trust.
Wow, wow, that's the type of thing that you never want to have happen for somebody who you look up to. Thanks for sharing that, Tim.
You're welcome.
Regina.
So I've worked on the academic side of the house for nearly all of my career, and those of you who also have the same journey know that sometimes we have our little mini heartbreaks on a regular basis. But what I'd like to talk about is my experience as half of a dual career couple, and some challenges I faced during a couple of periods of unemployment. So several years ago, my spouse and I had made a decision to leave the state we were in, and he was accepting a position that was a career advancing position for him. And it was going to be a new challenge for us. We were looking forward to it. I had been at my institution for 13 years. I had grown my profession there. I had been involved in ACPA State Division. I had made a lot of friends and colleagues, and really was not the same professional I had been, and was very happy about that. I spent my last couple of months in my position sort of preparing my successor for her new role, then also spending the time saying goodbye, and I really didn't spend the time on my job search in my new position. So when we moved, I was in a new state with a spouse and children and a lot of boxes and no job to go to. And so I think a lot of people know that unemployment is really challenging. It's a very challenging time in our lives. My spouse and my children were finding their ways in their new roles, and I just had this loss of identity. I had no title after my name. I had that my whole career, and one of the things that I remember was specifically getting very anxious as I was about to prepare to attend a student affairs conference, and I was going there knowing that my name tag would have my name but would be blank where everyone else had an institution listed, and so that was very challenging for me. I know that probably was also reflected when I interviewed as well, and I did end up accepting a position after about 8 months, and in time I ended up growing in that position, but it was probably the most stagnant part of my career, and was very for me emotionally was probably a time of where I just didn't grow.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, your story really resonates with me. I'm also a part of a dual career couple and had a similar experience when we moved to Michigan. So thank you for sharing that. Laura.
Well, I have a number of examples too, as Heather alluded to before. But for me, the one I think I might highlight is that in a previous position where I was the Chief Student Affairs Officer, we got a new president who came in and took some period of time, a year or so, to look at the institution and decide what he was looking for in the leadership and other pieces of it. And after a period of time, determined that most of the cabinet, including me, would turn over. And that was a very difficult time for me, even though it's a somewhat typical story, because it really got at my self-perception as a contributor to a leadership team and a contributor to an institution, and I began to doubt myself a little bit and try and make meaning as much as I could, but I didn't understand it for a while. It was very painful, and then that unemployment piece is also another piece of that as well, and so I guess that's the story that I would highlight.
Thanks for sharing that, Laura. Steve?
So my story is a little bit different than the ones that have been shared. It's more of a collection of events. When I came back to Berkeley 6 years ago, the very first day I was back, I attended a student affairs retreat. This was in January of 2009. And I learned at that point in time from the provost that the campus was facing some significant budget issues. And so from that point in time, there was this major effort on campus called Operational Excellence, where the goal was to trim $75 million annually in operating costs to become more efficient as a campus. This started with significant layoffs. Many folks, I think there were close to 300 people on campus, lost jobs. The campus also has looked at early retirement programs and other incentives to try to get people to retire. This has been really difficult over the last several years because many people with lots of institutional knowledge have left the campus. Many people who joined the campus community under this social contract idea that they would come, they would put in their years at Berkeley, they could retire from working in the state system, are now being faced with having to change their plans. It's made it difficult at times for us to recruit top knowledge because people see us as being in sort of a precarious position. And so that's been challenging as a leader to really try to do what we can to still motivate staff, still recruit top people. We're not out of the woods yet. There's still some additional initiatives that are being implemented for us to try to trim dollars. So it's just been really challenging as a leader to try to bring my best self to work each and every day to try to help people feel that they can still do what's right for students.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think in the face of the recession, a lot of our campuses have had a really similar story, Steve. So yeah, thank you for sharing that. So this session and this show actually emerged from a ed session that you all presented at ACPA in Tampa, Florida. And I'm curious about what you all specifically, like what brought you to decide to present that at ACPA, and can you talk a little bit about some of the underlying sources and literature that talks about professional heartbreak, or is there anything in the literature that talks about professional heartbreak that you used as foundational research for the session itself? Tim, would you be willing to do that?
I'm absolutely happy to do that. So the literature really, in a lot of ways, is not terribly traditional to our field of student affairs, but it really comes from a lot of the career development theory and also some of the kind of cognitive psychology pieces. And so some of the really critical pieces, one piece that I really love are a couple things around ethical decision making in terms of kind of how do you stay true to who you are, how do you really deal with it in a way that you don't compromise your values even though there's a lot of emotion that is attached to those heartbreaks. And then also how do you prepare yourself to be able to either continue to serve in a leadership role, go out in onto the job market to look for another position and really make sense of that, but not allow it to really derail you in the interview process. And that, a lot of that literature particularly is, you can find a lot of it around studies that have been done with mass layoffs in corporate America. And I think a lot of it is very translatable to the work that we've been in the sessions we've been talking about in higher education.
So tell me a little bit about how the session emerged. Regina, I think you were specifically involved in that. Like, what had come up for you that prompted the session? As you presented, what resonated with folks? What was the response from the people who attended?
Sure, thanks, Heather. So it probably comes as no surprise that our own heartbreak really prompted this presentation. So the four of us have been friends for a number of years, and like many other colleagues, we reconnect every year at ACPA, and we share our stories of heartbreak, both professional and personal. And Tim and I presented a session titled Healing Professional Heartbreak about 9 years ago with two other colleagues, and we decided it was time to really revisit this again. As we prepared for ACPA this year, we reflected on our journeys. We also discussed the heartbreaks that we have experienced over the years. And one of the interesting things, because we have been friends and because we've known each other's stories, we also were able to reflect back to each other to say, this is how I've seen you grow since then. And I think that was a nice piece for us to grow on a personal level. As we presented the session, as you might guess, I think a lot of the people were very excited to see this topic. People seemed sort of relieved. And I think there were some folks, obviously, who came there looking for advice on a situation they were currently dealing with. And I think it was also a nice time for folks to share their stories and just to have somebody listen to them. So I think that was something that's really key. Both times that we've done this presentation, I've left feeling that it should be one of those sessions that happens at convention every year. Of course, I think it really does happen through different panels and mentoring sessions and roundtables, etc.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that sometimes we do a disservice in student affairs by always talking about sunshine and rainbows and unicorns, and is that really the way it is on a majority of days at work? And sometimes this hard work is our job, right? We had an interesting comment from Twitter that I think would be good to discuss. Monica Falkman said one of the questions that she hopes that we talk about today is that sometimes heartbreak comes at the hands of our peers and the people who we trust the most, not just those who are, our superiors or our mentors. Laura, do you have some thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think it's a really good point. So professional heartbreak is something that's just normal. It's part of the process. We're always going to experience it. And if you think about our work with students, that's a large part of it is we help them try and figure out, where do you go when the world doesn't go the way you want it to. Sometimes that's of your own making. Sometimes we make mistakes, make a bad judgment. Sometimes we just don't bring our best game, whatever that is. Sometimes it's as a result of our peers hurting us. And I think that Monica's point is a really good one, because we often maybe expect that a departmental decision may not go our way or something like that, but we don't expect it as much from our colleagues and our peers and our friends. And it can be just, very heartbreaking, and I think it makes it perhaps more fraught personally, because there's not only the professional heartbreak and the disappointment, but it's also feeling maybe like a personal betrayal when it's our peers or people that we really think should have our back. And so what matters always in those situations is where we go from here, and then how do we make meaning of that? How do we keep or change or repair or let go of relationships? And the source of the heartbreak can make a really big difference in how we approach that.
Yeah. Any other thoughts from any of the rest of you?
Well, Heather, I think it is really important too. I know that some of what we talked about is really how can we prepare for this? Can we do anything to be proactive about it? And I think that's, for us, it's been really critical as a group to keep each other kind of in our circle of sages, if you will, that you have to be able to talk to people outside of your institution. Many times as you move up the career ladder, the group of peers becomes much narrower, and the challenge of sharing certain information can be a real one, in that some things you say might end up in the student newspaper or those sort of things. So it's really important to know who you can go to talk about and process the emotion around that. I always say every good student affairs administrator has a good therapist, in addition to colleagues like the ones that are with us today.
I agree. I absolutely agree. So let's get back to this idea of what we can do to prepare. So we plan our careers, we think about transitions, maybe somewhat intentionally. Sometimes those still lead to confusion and challenge and require us to work through those transitions in particular. But sometimes these transitions can come as a complete surprise. And so is there a way to prepare in advance for a transition that you don't know is going to happen? And if so, what do you suggest that folks in student affairs should do in order to get to that point? Tim, do you want to start with this, and then Regina?
Sure. I mean, I think you have to be realistic about, I think, your point about it not always being sunshine and rainbows. That life happens, whether it's your personal circumstances change and that requires, like in Regina's case, an unplanned move, or maybe a move where someone else's career is the genesis of that. I think you have to have that discussion with the significant other if that's going to be a situation that you're in. But I also think you have to be realistic. You have to kind of, in a lot of ways, start reading the tea leaves. So, many times, for example, we don't pay as close attention to the fiscal issues around the campus or understand what it means for a leadership change around us. So, like in Laura's example, you have a leadership change where those things can happen maybe within a year's time. But the reality is that if the person who's the vice president or the dean changes, those changes might not come right away, but you can start to see whether or not you're, kind of are jiving on the same plane and those sorts of things. Or, for example, like in our state right now, those are things that we can't, the budget cuts that we're facing, we couldn't have prepared for. We could have seen it coming to some degree. And I think managing and being realistic and not burying our heads in the sand is really critical in terms of not being caught off guard. And then on some level, when things happen that we can't predict, again, having those folks to go to be able to process that emotion, to take a bit of a deep breath before we react to it is going to be really important, because, of course, the decisions you make from that point forward will really shape how that transition happens, what that transition looks like, and also, in fairness to yourself, know that you're going to have some emotion around it, deal with that emotion, own it, and be okay with it. And I think that's really critical, because I think a lot of times as professionals, we kind of see ourselves or called upon to solve everyone else's concerns and issues, and we don't take the time to also know that some of that also requires good self-care.
Yeah, that's a great point. Regina?
Well, Tim took all of my points, but I'd like to start up where he ended, is with the idea of self-care, and I think that is very key. I think it's very important to take care of ourselves all of the time, but knowing that we're taking care of ourselves can help us prepare for these times of transition and upheaval that can happen with heartbreak. I also think that maintaining relationships, and so whether it's with colleagues or people in your family, friends outside of student affairs, there's just those folks that you can go to. And it's so easy to let things slip away because we're busy. We have to take the kids to practice and those kind of things, but those relationships are key. Those folks will help you through the times that seem tough and that are tough. Another thing I think it's important is to take those times where things are going well and to really spend some time to work on your own values and really taking the moment to write them down or preserving them in whatever way works for you. I attended a session on writing a personal mission statement at a conference recently, and I thought about how important that is for me in my life right now, and how important that is for those times where you do hit professional heartbreak, to go back to those values that you hold dear and know, yes, this is heartbreak, this is temporary, but these are my values. I'm going to put students first. I'm going to put myself and my family first, and take care of those things that are most important.
That's great. So we had another question from Twitter. I actually don't know who this came from, but I think that this is a really critical piece. And somebody else on Twitter mentioned about how professional heartbreak has led them to kind of create stronger boundaries with their colleagues. That was from Sarah Ackerson. But the question that emerges is, how can a heartbroken student affairs professional be vulnerable with their colleagues without going too far, given their concerns about their future career, especially if they want to stay on that campus, and then obviously the same kind of point about boundaries as well. Steve, do you have some thoughts on this?
Yeah, so I've found throughout my career, this is where having a professional association like ACPA is so critical, because you've got those colleagues that you can call up on the phone, email, what have you, and just get a different perspective on things. It is important to develop that balance between being able to talk to people in your work environment about personal issues that are impacting you, but then also then keeping those boundaries as well by not sharing too much. That's really hard when you're a supervisor, because sometimes you want to talk to staff members about things that are impacting the organization, but it's just not proper to do that, because it draws them into things that really need to remain confidential and at, say, a different level. So I found that just having those professional colleagues is so critical. And also, one of the other things I want to add too, I think related to this, is we've done some holistic type of approaches to these issues. One thing in particular is working with our counseling center on issues of resiliency. So having them come in and at a staff meeting, a professional development day, actually presenting widely on how we as a group can become more resilient, being able to bounce back from those small heartbreaks or large heartbreaks that might be impacting us on a professional or personal level.
Great. So the person who asked that question was Dr. Phil Covington, so thank you for adding that. Anyone else who has questions on Twitter, please send them with the Higher Ed Live hashtag, and we'll work them into our conversation today. So my next question has to do with how career transitions are really different from some of the other challenges that we face. Ethical dilemmas, institutional politics, personality conflicts. Those are different than moving out of positions and moving around institutions. And so, talk a little bit about how these are different and similar, and why we might want to approach these issues in a different way, or in a similar way, I guess. Steve, do you want to start, and then go to Laura?
Sure. That's a real challenge, I think, institutional politics. I mean, as I was describing my story earlier, I'm sure many of you in your head were going through just the politics that would be involved in an institution. I think it's so critical to try to establish those relationships across campus. And I think sometimes you just have to remind yourself, this is a job, and you have to, at the end of the day, walk away from it, not get sucked into some of the drama that happens. I know that that's hard to not do that. But I think just being able to set those boundaries and make sure that you establish those senses of self-care. I think with ethical dilemmas in particular, I find, again, it's really helpful to get different perspectives, because I may view things one way, but somebody else will view it from a very different way. And I found that also just using resources on campus, like human resource professionals or the counseling center or other places, to kind of make sure that you're doing things within the framework of what the policies and procedures might be on campus.
Yeah. Laura, do you have thoughts on this?
I thought Steve did an amazing job of answering, actually. But one of the questions is if the source of the professional heartbreak is a career transition versus a political situation or an ethical dilemma, are there different circumstances that mean we as professionals should respond differently? And I think in some ways yes, and in some ways no. When I've experienced these throughout my career, there are certain touchstones that I go back to, many of which we've mentioned already. Some of it is my professional values. What are the things that I have learned and have incorporated as my own personal mission statement, as Regina was talking about. That's always a foundation for me. But it's also, as I've advanced in my career, understanding the different contexts that we're working in, what battles to fight and what battles not to fight, and what are the intended and unintended consequences of that. And so I think that whatever the source of the professional heartbreak is, will have a different mix of all of those kinds of things, and the resiliency, the self-care, the the personal values, and just really being true to yourself as a person and a professional is what gets you through, and then you pull out an emphasis on something different depending on what the dilemma is. And the truth is that in some ethical dilemmas, it's worth leaving a position, you know, and in other ethical dilemmas, it's worth trying to work within the existing system to change it to be in a way that's more consistent with what you know as best practices or whatever. And so if you know yourself well enough and can figure that out, it will help lead you on a path forward.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think that the point that some of these issues are really at the individual level, some of them are at the organizational level, and some of them are at the system level, maybe sometimes can dictate how you interact with the dilemma. You know, if it's a one-on-one kind of thing versus system, I mean, I know in a previous position I was in, it was either I work within as a very new professional to change the situation or leave, and those were kind of the alternate choices at that point, which was really heartbreaking in a lot of ways to have to give up on something that I thought was maybe an opportunity. So I think, you know, Steve, you talked a little bit about this in terms of systems of support, and you talked about professional associations, which are, I think, a huge source of support for a lot of folks, including myself. You know, on your individual campuses, though, are there resources for employees who are facing a situation that might, you know, require them to call upon institutional resources? So, you know, at the institutional type, regardless of whether it's a private institution or a public institution. Steve, do you want to tackle this one first, and then we'll see if anyone else has other thoughts?
Sure. Well, we have a group within Student Affairs called Learning and Development, and it's basically our folks that will help us facilitate retreats. They do training. So they have become very adept at these types of change issues. And so there's this change curve that we pull out from Barrows that we always show to folks that kind of looks at all the different emotional stages people will go through when they're dealing with change, and the fact that people are at different points on that change curve. But they've become a tremendous set of resources for us, and they really have developed this expertise out of necessity to be able to help our division address these issues.
Laura, do you have resources on your campus that you've pointed towards or have used yourself?
Yeah, I do. There are both formal and informal resources that I think people can develop and take advantage of. There's always human resources departments can often be a really great place to go talk about these things in confidentiality. For a personal dilemma, there's EAP programs, employee assistance programs that might be available. Sometimes in particular situations, like we at the UW Platteville are talking about the possibility of layoffs and those kinds of things because of the budget system. Well, I know that my Academic and Career Advising Center and our Human Resources Office are putting together resources to help people transition in jobs, making connections with local chambers of commerce and economic development areas, those kinds of things. And I always try and make some key personal connections with folks across campus that can help me talk through things. As I've been here a little over a year and a half, and so now I'm getting a sense of who I feel like I can really trust to be fairly frank with, and who's not really in that room for me. And so, like, my chief business officer is somebody that I have as a really key resource that I can go in and say, look, here's something I'm struggling with, I'm experiencing. Can you help me understand the context? Because I wholeheartedly agree with what everybody has said about having very important connections off of campus who you trust, that know something about the field and can give you an objective viewpoint. I also think if there's a way to find really trusted colleagues on campus who do know the context, that helps as well.
That's great. Anyone else on their own campus have resources that they've turned to or referred folks to?
Heather, I think certainly Laura highlighted the EAP program, but I think sometimes we don't often think about that as another resource to process these sorts of things. We think, well, you know, the firewall becomes, is it personal or is it professional? And the reality is that there's really a blend there. And as you think about the emotion connected with lots of these transitions and challenges, I think it's really critical to think about how do you access that EAP as another confidential source to help you work through those things. Many times, most of our EAP programs have been broadened out enough, and our campuses have purchased, for example, we are a large system, so we have lots of kind of things that are snap-ons to that program. You just have to ask for them or talk with one of the consultants about, the sort of resources you might want.
Great. So we had another interesting question from Twitter. This Corey Fair asked, this might be a silly question, but how do you differentiate between heartbreak and disappointment or / discomfort? Is there a difference in terms of the level of severity? Steve, do you want to tackle this one?
Yeah, first of all, I just want to say great things coming across Twitter. I appreciate all the comments people are making. I'm trying to multitask and watch those at the same time. That's a great question from Corey. For me, disappointment is something that, at the end of the week, I may not remember it. It's not going to cause me to lose sleep necessarily. It may pop up in my brain if I run into that person again, if it's an interaction that's caused disappointments. A heartbreak is something that's going to be tough to get over. It's something I'm going to remember months later, years later. I'm going to have stories about it. I'm going to have probably many times in my own head I'm trying to make sense of what that heartbreak means for me. I know there's even times throughout my career where I've had heartbreak, but then I've had an epiphany later on where I've thought, you know what, now I understand, because I'm at a different level in the organization, why that thing occurred the way it did. So that would be my answer.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. In fact, when I think back to the things that I would consider to be heartbreaks, it's been 10 years or 5 years, and there's still something that I remember really clearly about that. And I'm curious about, when we look back and we do that reflection, and hindsight's often 20/20, but is there anything that we can do retroactively, especially if the heartbreak was very personal, individual to individual? Is there anything we can do to repair our relationships with those folks who either we have hurt or have hurt us, or we've been hurt through the process? Regina?
Yes, I do think so, and I'm an optimist, so I always believe we can repair relationships. And I think it depends on the type of relationship you've had in the past and how you would like to see that relationship moving forward. So I think those are a couple of key pieces. And I think it's important sometimes to step back and remember that all of those thoughts and feelings that we've experienced with the heartbreak, maybe the other person didn't. Maybe they've moved on. Maybe they haven't. Maybe they're more angry or upset than we are, even 5-10 years later. And so it's important to know that we might not know what the other person is still experiencing about the heartbreak. And I think it goes a long way to try and be the person to reach out, to own our own feelings and our actions, to share what we did, and to, if appropriate, to apologize for what we did if we've caused somebody else pain. And then, it just sometimes the little things, a handwritten note can go a long way in terms of touching someone's heart. I know that a lot of times when a colleague sends me a cheer you up kind of a note, that's great. But sometimes we need to do that when we've caused pain as well. And just remember that student affairs is a small world. There's a chance we may run into each other again, maybe at a conference. We might be working on the same campus again. And so there's always a reason to repair relationships.
Absolutely. Wow, we have had quite the great questions from Twitter today. So Ina Link asks, how can you disconnect on an emotional level when facing an organizational ethical dilemma but still manage to do a good job? Tim, do you want to tackle this?
I'd love to. I don't know that I would love to be in this situation, but I think the reality is that what we have to do is think about, as Steve said, it's our job, and so it's work, and so we have to. For each of us, that line is going to be a bit different, but we have to at least be conscious about the fact that we need to create that line. And so I think we also have to think about, when we look at ethical dilemmas, kind of how much harm is that likely to cause, both to those affected by it, including yourself. If you absolutely have to compromise who you are. You know your compass very well, and so I think you have to use that gauge. But I also will say, you know, you have to be very cautious, because, you know, one thing I'm fond of saying, and everybody I think has heard me say on this group has heard me say it a few times, is, are we willing to die on every hill?
Mm-hmm.
You know, the reality is that not every ethical dilemma for us is an ethical dilemma. It may be that it's inconsistent with who we are as a person, but it's not asking us to break the law. It's not asking us to do something that we shouldn't do, but maybe something that we're not comfortable doing. I think the other thing is that if we really feel like there's some high stakes there and we don't want to kind of take it on very publicly, it's important to make sure that we keep some notes about it and document those things, so that if there's ever a question about that, you're able to, for example, if you have to go back through some of those processes like HR and those sort of things, you have a good record of what you were asked to do and when and those sort of things. But sometimes it's, you know, it's not necessarily about compromising ethics as much as it also is understanding where our values may be a bit inconsistent with perhaps some of the leadership we work for. Institutionally, of course, we can do some of that work ahead of time to get to know as much as we can about the fit of the institution and the folks we're going to work with. But those people change, and so you have to always kind of reassess those and recalibrate those. And to some degree, you have to say, look, this isn't there are some times where my supervisor may ask me to do things that I wouldn't necessarily approach it in that way. But it also isn't requiring me to do something that's going to put myself or someone else in jeopardy. I think for me, that's my line. Where I feel like if somebody's going to be harmed by it, I'm going to take a stronger stance and perhaps try to look at ways. But I think that's also a good way to consult with colleagues, not to immediately react, but to kind of pull back and say, I'm presented with this situation that feels like it's an ethical dilemma for me. I may be asked to do something illegal, those sort of things. And so, you know, being able to brainstorm that a little bit, it's important to take a little time with it and not immediately have a knee-jerk reaction, because that's really where I see people get into real challenges, is they get very emotionally invested, they react very quickly, and there's some mistakes that are made along the way because we haven't kind of thought it through.
Yeah, I have a good friend and colleague from a former institution who recently resigned a position based on an ethical dilemma. And, you know, I think he's garnered a lot of respect for taking that stance. But, you know, I guess my follow-up to that is, how do you know when that is kind of a make it or break it situation and you are willing to take that ultimate step and resign? Any thoughts?
I think, you know, ultimately you're your own best barometer. So all of us we all have those moments. We all have those issues, whether it's around equity or it's around, perhaps using, for example, funds in questionable ways. There are lots of ethical situations that are presented. Ultimately, what do you want your legacy to be? Will it really compromise you? Because, and again, I think some of that, I suspect that your colleague, though I don't know him personally, did some soul searching and said, look, I couldn't live with myself if I didn't make this choice. And in some cases, there's fiscal realities to that, right? I have a family. There's a different threshold for me in terms of what I'm going to have to do, or at least how much time I'm going to need before I make my exit plan. But if I decide to make that exit plan, it's because it's an issue enough for me that I feel like ultimately I give up a part of myself by being complicit in doing those sorts of things. And for many of us in our profession, I think that does center around issues of equity and fairness and those sorts of things. But also, if we outright know something illegal is occurring and we can't use mechanisms to have that rectified, for example, many campuses have confidential services where we can report an ethical issue or those sorts of things. So we can't remedy it that way. Then we might make the decision to make that transition or be a little more assertive about what action plan we take.
Yeah, it's a tough choice to make, especially when you have lots of other things to consider in your life, as he did. So I'm curious about what we can learn. I mean, I think this is the point of this show, right? Is that, we've faced these dilemmas and we've had these circumstances impact our careers, and what do we do with this information? How do we turn these difficult situations into growth opportunities, both for ourselves, for our future colleagues, so that we maintain kind of the positive perspectives about the field that we're in. Steve?
So it will come as no surprise to the folks on this broadcast that student affairs, the profession of student affairs, can be an all-encompassing profession. And I think in order for us to turn those situations to growth opportunities, we really have to be able to develop perspective about what's happening. I know for me, again, this is where it comes down to focusing on your core values. Somebody on Twitter talked about actually having a personal mission statement, which I think is a great way as a grounding point, a touchstone by which to decide or develop strategies or ideas for how you're going to turn things into growth opportunities. And I think sometimes just being able to make sure that outside of your work environment you've got the support structures there so that you can continue to grow as a person, and whatever those strategies might be for you. So that's critical.
Others of you have something to add to this?
Yeah, I have something. As we go through these experiences, one of the things that I've learned is that it's never an end point. It's always a piece of the journey. And so Steve did a great job of articulating a lot of the things you can learn, putting your job in perspective with the rest of your life. But it's always also opening another door. And sometimes when it feels like the absolute end, what it does is open a whole new path, which may be the path we were supposed to be on, depending on our value system or whatever that is. But looking back at these things that still stick with me years later, I think, oh my goodness, so these are the personal lessons that I learned, these are the professional lessons that I learned, and it set me on this completely different path that I would never have taken without that conflict. So I can never look at it like this in the moment. I can tell myself that, but I never feel that way in the moment, that, oh my goodness, this is actually a really great opportunity for growth, and it's going to teach me things I need to learn, and it's going to put me on the path that I need to be on, that I couldn't have done without that very difficult situation. But it does. I mean, looking back in my life, every time and maybe that's a luxury, or maybe most people feel that way, I'm not sure, but it always ends up being rewarding in the long run, as painful as it is.
Yeah, I mean, I think back on some of the circumstances that I've had, and what I've learned is really shaped kind of who I am now as a professional. What kind of supervisor I would want to be, the types of relationships I build with my colleagues as a result of some past circumstances. So that's really a good point. Tim, you have some thoughts too?
Yeah, I think, I'll be very Oprah about it in that, I think the kind of similar to what Laura said is I try to ask myself, what's the lesson, right? What is this challenge being presented to me? And I think ultimately, for example, the situation that I highlighted, a lot of my mentors said, it's painful, but the reality is that there's also a big function in you moving from a place that you're comfortable to get broader experiences and either return to that place or continue to grow your career. So ultimately, what was a very emotionally difficult situation presented the opportunity to push me to move kind of around in my career and not stay comfortable. And that was the lesson. It took a while to get there. I think it does take you have to really be comfortable with spending some time with yourself and being introspective. And not only, I found it less productive to blame and more productive to say, okay, is there anything I contributed to the situation or I could have seen that I didn't see? And also just being realistic about the fact that these are the cards that are dealt. And I have to play that hand, and I have to move forward, and I can fight it all I want, but it is the reality.
Yeah. Regina, do you have thoughts on this?
Yes, I'd like to follow up a couple of Laura's comments. And in the moment, we don't see it as a growth opportunity, but looking back, I can see all of these transitions for myself and do see growth during that time, and I can share that with other colleagues, especially professionals who have not been around as long or not had as many experiences, and I can help them get through their transitions and through their heartbreak as well.
Yeah. So Rohan Thakur, I hope I'm pronouncing that name right, asked another great question, which has to do with what can be done to encourage departmental conversations in response to colleagues leaving due to ethical concerns. So the people who are remaining, how do you handle that circumstance if you're the supervisor or the director of the department and somebody has left? That's a really fabulous question. Who is interested?
I guess I'll take it on.
Okay.
I think I think there's a fine line between, discussing personnel matters and those sort of things. But I think when we experience, what I found to be helpful is it's also a good opportunity to maybe do a little bit of a refresher around decision making and what policies and procedures are about how we make good decisions based on the institutional culture, and not divulge too much of that information, because of course that could be potentially illegal, but also I think from my perspective a bit unethical. But I think ultimately it's also important to recognize that many people probably knew what was going on in some way, shape, or form. So reminding people that it's okay to talk about those things and what resources they have to access that, and just in general having a regular conversation within the department around making good decisions ethically.
Yeah. I mean, I think as a former supervisor, I don't supervise anyone now because I'm a doctoral student, but as a former supervisor, sometimes it's that fine line of having to process and the group talking about the transition, but also kind of helping that group move forward without that person present within the space any longer, and that can be a difficult, challenging, especially if you as a supervisor know details that you literally can't share because it's a personnel issue, and there's other circumstances as well. Laura, you have some thoughts on this too?
Yeah, just one other piece. We've been talking a lot in this section about the sort of interpersonal response, but depending on what the circumstances are, the leader of the department may want to talk with other folks in the institution to determine whether or not it would be appropriate to talk about the content of it as well, because I suspect if there is a person who left, and I agree with Tim that a lot of people will know what the circumstances are probably, or at least pieces of it. It may be worth the investment of some time to talk about the content in addition to the process pieces. That may not always be possible, just like the personnel related stuff means there's confidentiality that you can't share, but that may be a way for the department to heal.
Yeah. So we're running up on the end of our questions. If anybody has other questions from Twitter, we'll try to incorporate them in our last few minutes. But I always like to end shows on Student Affairs Live with additional resources. So it might be articles, TED Talks, books, etc., that our viewers can review if they'd like more information or additional discussion about this. So could each of you share a resource, as well as maybe one thing that you hope are takeaways from this show as a result of us airing it today? So Regina, do you want to start?
Sure. So I recently read a book titled Transformative Conversations. It's a guide to mentoring communities among colleagues in higher education. And I just finished this book, so I'm not exactly sure how I'm going to work it into Heartbreak, but it seems to me that mentoring communities might be a way to really help us prepare for that eventual heartbreak or other transitions that we might face in higher education. And it also seems to be something that's probably fits right now in my life, so I don't know if 20 years ago in my career it would have been a great fit, but it maybe for those of us who have been in the profession a long time, it might be a nice fit. So if anybody wants to talk about that, come and let me know. But one of the other pieces that I wanted to leave people with is that a colleague reminded me as I was facing a number of transitions and as I left a position, she reminded me that it is a grieving process. Just as other grieving processes, we need to give it time, we need to give it space, and we do need to grieve to get through and get on to the other side. And so I think it's important to make that time for ourselves and potentially for colleagues that we work with as well.
Thank you. Tim?
One of the resources I absolutely adore is I had a colleague at a previous institution. We did some work because I worked with adult students who were making transitions. And so we did a lot of work around folks who've been outsourced, who lost jobs, who needed to retool, those sort of things. In her book, Back in Control, How to Stay Sane, Productive, and Inspired in Your Career Transition, my colleague is Diane Wilson. It's a good piece, and there's a lot of pieces that can really transfer to various situations that require you making decisions around ethics or actually taking a new position, whether you've decided to make that and you're in control of it or not, but ultimately kind of how do you get back on track. I think the piece I would want folks to take away is, in our profession, so many times I think we feel like we have to solve it and not kind of be experiencing difficulty and challenge and emotion in the same way that our students and others around us do. We take on that leadership mantle so much that we kind of get a little jaded or a little concerned when we start to kind of show our real selves. And so ultimately, it's very real for anybody experiencing that for whatever reason. And so to take your opportunity to reflect, to do the work that you need to do to get yourself to a good place, whatever that is, or to a different place, is really important. And to not be ashamed of the fact that it may take a while. It may take some reflection and some, as Regina said, going through that grief process and all those stages. Sometimes you're going to be angry. Sometimes you're going to be sad about it. Sometimes you're going to really get to a place where you're empowered and you're moving on. And that's a process, and it's okay for that to last as long as it needs to, but be careful about any transitions or things that you're going to make after that, because you want to make sure you've really kind of tightened that up a bit so you don't go into a situation looking bitter or like you've got an axe to grind, those sorts of things.
Great. Laura, your resources and final thought.
Yeah, I recently read Brene Brown's Daring Greatly and watched her TED Talk, and one of my own personal things is that I like to perceive myself as Superwoman, and I'm impervious to all this kind of stuff, and I do have a challenge making myself vulnerable, which makes it hard to be resilient when you're facing heartbreak. That's why I share that piece of it. And so I've been trying to work on that a bit with myself. And so her TED Talk and her book were really great resources for me to delve into a piece of myself that I haven't polished the skill to be vulnerable and then show courage in that way. And it's been actually very helpful in relation to the heartbreak piece of it as well, because it helps me think about my values, find my footing, and give myself a bit of a break, to allow myself a little bit of room to be a whole person and not Superwoman. So I would recommend them. And for my takeaway, I think in situations of heartbreak, whatever the cause, whether we've caused it ourselves or somebody else has a pretty big role in it, we often feel alone, or I have felt alone in those situations. And I just want people to know you're not alone. These are very typical situations, and they're going to happen to a greater or lesser degree throughout your entire career and your personal life. And so reach out to friends and colleagues, find professional support, because you will get through it, and it's normal and a good part of life.
Yeah. I agree, and I think it is important for us to not make it out to be this thing that never happens, because I think many of us, if not once but multiple times during our careers, will have that experience. So it's all about coming back to that learning moment. Steve.
Well, it's tough to add to what my colleagues have already said. They've tapped into a lot of great resources. I talked earlier about the concept of resilience, and there's a lot of stuff out there related to resilience from the APA and other organizations. Being resilient doesn't mean that you're impervious to those issues. It just means you're able to develop strategies to bounce back. One of the things I've learned this year, having a freshman in college, is that when issues arise, I try to reframe it for myself and say, okay, if my daughter was sitting before me with an issue, or a student was sitting before me an issue, what would I say to them in terms of how they could deal with with whatever heartbreak or challenges they're facing. How could I help them reframe it? How could I help give them some resources? And so I think that might just be a mindset to have when you're going through this. It kind of helps you to step outside of your own situation a little bit and think about, okay, if I were trying to help somebody else, how might I help guide them through this situation?
Yeah, that's great. I love the idea of putting yourself in that kind of personal circumstance. If that person was sitting in front of me, what would I say? Those are great suggestions. So I just saw Tim's chat. We have a chat on the side in case people are wondering, how do we know that we're going to the next person? Chat, I would just really like to encourage you all to think about submitting a book proposal, because I think this is a fabulous topic. I think it resonates with a lot of folks, and that type of resource perhaps doesn't quite exist. And we have a lot of career transition type books, but nothing that kind of talks about this topic as frankly as you all have today. So thank you very much for that suggestion, and I highly recommend that you all put that forward as a proposal. And also just in general, I appreciate all of you sharing your stories today. I know that takes a lot of vulnerability to do that, to come on the show. So I appreciate the time that you all have spent. And everyone who's engaged on Twitter, it's been a great back channel today, so hopefully folks will go back and check out the Higher Ed Live hashtag. So coming up next week, I'm doing back-to-back shows, and I'm really excited to be having a show about studying college student leadership. And on the show will be Susan Comabez, John Dugan, Julie Owen, and Leslie Ann Henderson-Brown. And we're going to be specifically talking about that multi-institutional study of leadership, but the college student leadership broadly as well. And so we're really excited about that show coming up next week, same time, Wednesday at noon. And you can receive reminders about this and all of the other great shows on Higher Ed Live by subscribing to our newsletter. You can also browse our archives at higheredlive.com, and you can subscribe to our iTunes podcast to listen to past episodes. There's multiple ways to access the content that we've provided for you all for free on Student Affairs Live and on the broader channel. So again, thank you to my guests. Thank you to our sponsors. I'm Heather Shea Gasser. Thanks for watching, everyone. Make it a great week.